Thank you, sir. Mr. Bissett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to speak to you. I'm not a member of the Fraser Institute, but more relevant, I was the head of the Canadian Immigration Service from 1985 to 90. So I'm going to talk about...
Right.
Yeah, you had that right. I'm going to talk about a controversial subject today. I'm going to concentrate on security in relation to Muslim immigration. I think it's an important subject, and it's one that very few people want to talk about. But because of my age, and I think I can get away with saying things that other people might be frightened to say. It's an important subject, and it's one that I think the committee should certainly examine very carefully. Before I do that, I'm prepared afterwards to answer questions on any of the immigration subjects you're dealing with. I'd be happy to do that. The basic problem of security screening, in my own view, quite apart from Muslim immigration, is that the volume of immigrants that are coming to Canada and the large number, more recently, of temporary foreign workers and of foreign students, and the volume of asylum seekers that are coming into the country make it almost impossible for visa officers abroad or the CSIS security officers to do an adequate job. They just can't do it. They have all their time issuing visas to the point, as you probably already know, that very few of our immigrants today are even interviewed or seen by a visa officer, quite apart from a security officer. That's the basic problem. The security abroad of people coming to Canada is essentially non-existent, and that is the most serious threat on the broader term. You know, we have, for example, from 25 to 35,000 asylum seekers coming in from any country in the world. None of them are screened for criminality, security, or health before they arrive. Very few immigrants are even looked at, and none of the temporary workers go through security or criminal checking. So they just come into the country. There's no tracking of them. We don't keep track of them. So the thing is a bit of a mess, quite frankly. But let me get back to the one subject that I think is the most serious security issue for Canada, and that is Muslim immigration. From 1990 to 2009, we admitted over 530,000 Muslim immigrants coming direct from Muslim countries, not counting the many thousand who come from England, from France, from the United States. We know that large numbers of these are coming from countries that produce terrorism, from Pakistan, from Algeria, from Saudi Arabia, from Morocco, from Iran. I have some figures here. From Iran, for example, we had 40,586 immigrants from Iran during that period, 2000 to 2009. We had 118,000 and more from Pakistan. We had 40-some thousand from Morocco, 30-some thousand from Algeria. Very few of these people are screened for security because the resources don't exist. You have already been told, I think, from a colleague of mine, that 1 in 10 applicants from Pakistan may get a security screening, 1 in 10. The other problem is that screening in most of these kind of countries are totally useless because they get the information from the local authorities. And in many of these countries, you can buy a criminal clearance or a security clearance for a significant bribe. I know many of those cases from my own experience. The only effective measure, in a sense, of having security screening at all today is that the immigrants themselves don't know that they're not being screened, and therefore it acts as a form of deterrence. That's about how effective it is. It would be foolish, and I'm not foolish enough to suggest that the Muslims that are coming here, or even the greater number of them, pose any kind of security risk. We know they don't. But on the other hand, it would be foolish and naive to think that many of those that are coming are not possible terrorists, or at least are susceptible and naive enough to buy into the extreme types of Islam that they are being taught in some of the mosques in Canada. We've had the experience of Europe. There isn't a European country that has experienced fairly large-scale migration from Muslim countries that hasn't got very serious problems, both from a security point of view and from an integration point of view. On the security point of view, the bombings in London, the bombings in Madrid, the murder of Van Gogh in the Netherlands, the outrage because of the Danish cartoons, all of those European countries have had terrorist experiences. Integration is a serious problem in France, in Germany. In London, there are many sections of England where Muslim immigrants are practicing Sharia law and have constituted Muslim enclaves with very little hope of ever integrating them. This is true in Denmark, it's true in Sweden, it's a serious problem in the Netherlands and in Germany. And these countries have already begun to take measures to try and integrate their people. Canada has not been immune. We've had the Toronto 18 plotting to behead the Prime Minister and blow up the CN Tower. We've had Momin Khawaja, who participated in the bombing plot in London, is serving life imprisonment. We've had Ahmed Razan, the Algerian asylum seeker, who attempted to try and blow up the Los Angeles airport. He came into Montreal as an asylum seeker. He didn't bother even appearing before the IRB. He was traveling back and forth from Afghanistan. We've had that kind of a problem here, and we're dealing with it, I think, fairly effectively. But the real problem is we should be screening people before they get here. I think the government's step of forcing people who apply for citizenship to read the new pamphlet that's out that suggests some of the obligations and responsibilities of citizenship is a step in the right direction. But we should be doing that before people come to Canada, not after they get here. People coming from these particularly Muslim countries, what I would apply to all countries, should be interviewed personally by a visa officer, as they used to be. If the visa officer thought there was anything suspicious, he referred it to the security officer who was at the post, and they did a much more thorough examination. That's gone by the boards now. We're not even seeing people. I think, as I mentioned once before, if you're in Bangladesh and you want to come to Canada, you fill out the forms, attach your certificates, your trades qualifications. They go to London. A junior officer screens that in paper, and if all is in order, stamps it, and mails the visa back to Dhaka, which you will then pick up and fly to Montreal or Toronto. You don't see anybody. I mean, this is an outrage in my view. So that's my major point. I think that we are lucky in this sense that the Muslim communities in Canada are a very diverse group. They represent almost every shade and variety of Islam. They tend to be better educated than the Muslims that have gone into Europe. They're working better. They have better employment chances than the European Muslims. But we needn't be complacent. There was an Environic poll in 2006 that showed that 12% of the Muslims polled in Canada firmly supported and believed that the Toronto 18 were doing the right thing. 18,000 of the 700,000 Muslims in Canada, roughly at that point, represent over 80,000 Muslims in Canada who fully approved of the Toronto 18 plot. I think that's cause for concern. The media played that 12% down, and some of the Muslim organizations in Canada dismissed it. But it's serious. And in my view, the committee should take a look at this. I think all immigrants, not necessarily elderly people or young children, but all of the male members and spouses of Muslim immigrants coming from countries where we know they produce terrorists should be interviewed and seen. And that should carry on to other countries as well. But the more critical issue here is we shouldn't pretend that we have a war against terror. It's not a war against terror. It's a war primarily against Muslim terror. And more effort should be made, I think, by the government to integrate the immigrants that are here, and particularly the young ones. My own Muslim friends that I know very well are very, very concerned about the number of young Muslims in Canada who are being influenced by extreme Islamists in some of the mosques in Canada. We have young Somali Canadians going off to support al-Shabaab in Somali. We have these young boys in Toronto that are willing to plot against it. The committee should do something about that if they can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bissett. We always enjoy your presentations. Particularly speaking without notes is always impressive. Mr. Merrifield, a fresh voice. You have 7 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. No, I appreciate your comments to the committee with regard to Muslim immigration and your concern with regard to that. It really is a battle between, the Islamic religion as the extremist and the moderates, and it's the battle to how do you discern who's a moderate, who's an extremist, and that threat that creates to the population of Canada. I don't argue with that, but you made some interesting comments with regard to the amount and numbers of immigrants that are coming in, foreign worker program and so on, and that they're not being checked thoroughly enough or have a one-on-one, and they can't possibly. That should cause us a little bit of a concern. You also wrote in a paper, in the one that says, "Does Canada pose a security threat to the United States?" And that your thoughts there were that the United States had to tighten the 49th parallel because they didn't think that we could prevent terrorists from coming into Canada, and we were a siphon or a sort of an opportunity for them to be siphoned down across the 49th. I think this is true. I mean, Chertoff set up Homeland Security, or was the head of Homeland Security initially after 9/11. I've heard him. I've actually been in meetings where he said that that almost indicated we had a terrorist under every tree in Canada, and that. That's a bit of an extreme comment, but nonetheless, he said there were hundreds of them coming across. I actually challenged him. I said, "Where are they then?" Because he didn't catch them at the border. If he said there was hundreds of them, he knew there were hundreds of them. Where are they? Then he had to backtrack on those. So I guess my question comes down to the issue of Canadian security with regard to, and how you compare that to the United States security. Because every time there's another threat, whether it's the shoe bomber, the diaper bomber, the cartridge bomber, there's added layers of security that have been put on, both the United States and Canada, and actually internationally. So the question becomes then, all of these bombers actually attacked America, not Canada. If they were successful, they would have actually landed, two of them, the last two would have landed in Canada. But it goes to what was said earlier about the advance list and making sure we know who gets on a plane coming to Canada prior to them actually landing, trying to come in, or into America. But specifically, what would, in your estimation, what would America have over Canada with regard to security as far as these people coming into their country?
Yes, well, first of all, I mean, Canada has done a great deal since 9/11 on the security side.
Yes,
I got a long list of things here that we've done. I mean, we responded quickly and very well. I mean, 3 months after 9/11, Parliament passed an omnibus terrorist bill. Not everybody agreed with it, but it was shown to be taking action. We did a lot of other things and have done. But at the heart of the matter, in the terms of the U.S. Congress, they think we haven't done enough. They see us as the weak link in North American security, and they see it primarily because of our refugee and immigration policies. Hillary Clinton has said more than once that the 19 terrorists that blew up the World Trade Center came from Canada. CBS announced on the day of the bombing of the Trade Center that they came in to Vermont from Quebec.
They were wrong.
They're wrong, and everybody's been attempting to tell them they're wrong, but even fairly recently they've repeated it. So that started them off, and they still have that view. They've created a monstrosity in Homeland Security, a budget of $70 or $80 billion. They fortified the border. It's no longer the undefended border. It's militarized, essentially. And it's primarily because of the...
Before my time is gone, though, you're absolutely right. I've been in Washington working very closely with the U.S. Congress and Senate on these issues. You're absolutely right on their perception. They're wrong, 100% wrong. My question was more of a technical one, because they're wrong on this as well, in my estimation, that we are more vulnerable, or we're weaker on our immigration system than they are on theirs with regard to foreigners coming into our country.
No, we're not. We're much better in many ways than they are on the immigration side. We are more vulnerable on the asylum seeker side, where we let in, as I said, in 2008, we let in 37,000 asylum seekers who just walk into the country without any kind of screening. They're in the country for 2 or 3 years before they even get to the IRB. And when they get to the IRB, if they're found not to be genuine, very few of them are ever sent home.
Recommendations to tighten up
Tighten that up, definitely. The other thing they're better at us, of course, is on the technical side in some respects. They're ahead of us in a little bit in terms of the micro biometrics. They do screen their immigrants, not the illegal ones that cross the southern border, but the ones that apply from abroad. They do get better screening. And our own security forces rely a great deal on the U.S. security information. If we do screen, we usually try and get information from the U.S. in the country concerned, who know much more about what's going on there than we do, because our CSIS officers are not allowed, as you know, to conduct operations abroad. So, yep.
Foreign worker program, I mean, it's not going away. We're going to need, especially in the West, we need, our number one problem is the lack of labor. So we're going to need the foreign workers. So should we, in light of what you've just said, be looking more to the United States for foreign workers and other international countries?
Well, I'm concerned about the foreign worker program because we're bringing in almost as many temporary foreign workers into Canada as we do immigrants. And they don't have to meet any educational or language or skill requirements. Some of them are highly skilled and educated, but the bulk of them are not. They're fairly unskilled, reasonably cheap labor that's being brought into the country. And the reason the employers have to get them is that they can't get a skilled worker from the immigration stream anymore. You might wait 8 years if you're a good carpenter or mechanic or a tool maker. You're in the backlog of 1 million people. And so the employer can't get those kinds of workers, although there has been some improvement in that with this list of 29 occupations that can be pulled into the front of the line. But I don't think we should be making the same mistake as the Europeans did in the 60s and 70s, bringing in thousands of temporary workers that are foreign and are workers, but they're not temporary. They don't go home. And there's no control over them in Canada. They come in, they can arrive in Brandon to work in a meatpacking plant there. The next day they can fly to Toronto. The employer isn't even required to report that they've left.
Thank you, Mr. Bissett. Mr. Kellaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you, Mr. Bissett and Mr. Brower, for your testimony today. Mr. Brower, you unfortunately ran out of time because of what's more of an aesthetic issue than a technical issue, I think, not to imply you're not a good-looking guy and that. But so I wanted to use some of my 7 minutes to give you the opportunity to finish some thoughts on the issues that you didn't get a chance to finish. And one of those of particular interest to me is the issue of the detention of children. So I was wondering if you could complete your thoughts on that for us, please.
Thank you so much for that opportunity. What I was going to say is that you had some witnesses earlier in these proceedings who talked to you about the detention of children, and you were given the number or the figure of 227 children detained in one, I think, fiscal year. That number was given to you by CBSA. What I wanted to note for you is that the reality is that the majority of children in detention centers are probably not being captured by the statistics because they're considered by CBSA to be guests of the detainees rather than detainees themselves. That's because they're Canadian citizens, and CBSA cannot detain Canadian citizen children. CBSA takes the position that they're only detaining the non-citizen parents. The Canadian children who are detained with them are theoretically free to go and are merely accompanying the parents in jail because the parents choose to have them there. That, of course, is a legal nicety that's as meaningless as the minister's insistence that Canada never deports Canadian children, just as their non-citizen parents or rather, they never deport Canadian citizen children. They only deport their non-citizen parents, and it's the parents who choose to bring along with them when they're being deported their young children. And that's a way of the Canadian government washing its hands of deportations and detentions of children that, from our experience at the Refugee Law Office, appears to be significantly higher than the 227 reported by CBSA. So I wanted to make sure that the committee is aware of that, and I would suggest if you do have CBSA back before you, that you ask them for some clarification and some more detailed numbers about the actual number of kids in jails in Canada, in immigration jails.
Mr. Brower, do you have
The
do you have a sense of the numbers yourself?
Unfortunately, I don't.
Sorry, I interrupted.
There was a report by Janet Cleveland. I think she appeared before you. Is that right? In a previous proceeding, she, I think, did include some discussion and did some research on the number of kids in detention. And I'd refer back to that.
Could you provide that report to the committee?
Of course.
Thank you very much.
You send that to the clerk, Mr. Brower.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So, Mr. Brower, I interrupted you. You were continuing your conversation, your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you. The other comment I wanted to make about detention was in relation to some evidence that you got about the monitoring of detention conditions by UNHCR and the Red Cross. I think it was Mr. Davies who had asked whether the Red Cross is paid by the Canadian government to do the detention monitoring. And Mr. Linklater of CIC, I believe, responded that the Red Cross is not, and that was the end of that conversation. What I wanted to make sure that this committee knows, though, is that the monitoring of detention conditions by the Red Cross is done on a strictly confidential basis. So while it's true, I understand that the Red Cross regularly monitors the jails where immigrants and refugees are detained, they report back to Immigration and CBSA on a confidential basis. There's absolutely no public reporting about their findings. There's no transparency to the process. So while on paper it looks like there's some degree of accountability, in fact, there's not. Obviously, a private and confidential report to the government about its own detention practices in the absence of any public disclosure is not accountability. So I wanted to make sure that this committee is aware of that.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, you and Mr. Bissett seem to come at the security issue from very different perspectives. You described sections 34 and 35 as too broad and arbitrary. If I understand Mr. Bissett correctly, and I think he's been pretty clear, that we have inadequate security procedures to deal with terrorism, and in particular Muslim terrorism. From your perspective as a lawyer in your practice, I'm wondering what thoughts you might have to share with us about Mr. Bissett's testimony today.
Thank you. Well, there's a few issues. I'll try to limit it. I guess one of the key points is that what Mr. Bissett is talking about is pretty different from what I was talking about. Our subjects were different. I was talking about the problems specifically in the law and the application of the law. I would be surprised, well, maybe not too surprised, but I don't think it's sustainable to argue that the Act itself isn't broad enough to cover the kinds of so-called terrorists that Mr. Bissett's talking about. The Act is extremely broad and certainly is broad enough to cover the kinds of people that he was referring to when he used his examples of the shoe bomber and the others. Mr. Bissett's comments about the need for more overseas screening, that doesn't appear to be rooted in any direct experiences of threats to Canada by people who weren't screened overseas. I think it's probably obvious to you that I'm going to have concerns, and I would assume that's shared fairly broadly, about Mr. Bissett's comments specifically, repeatedly, about Muslim terrorism. I think the issue for national security has to do with terrorism and national security, and what's required to keep Canada safe. Turning it into a religious or ethnic problem is obviously a problem from an equality and human rights perspective. In terms of Mr. Bissett's suggestion that every single person seeking to come to Canada be screened first, Frankly, I have no particular problem with that if it were doable. I can't imagine that CIC has the resources to send off well-educated and trained officers to interview every single person seeking to come to Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Brower.
But I don't. If we're, well, it would be fine.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, both of you are presenting fairly dichotomous views of the process of evaluating the immigration applicants into our country. Mr. Brower, you're presenting a point of view that information obtained for individuals in sub-Saharan Africa where record keeping and other intelligence gathering may be less than robust, still is flagged on a file for years and years and years to come, even after the individual presents themselves to Canada for years. Mr. Bissett, you present an immigration screening system which basically could not tell you whether or not a current applicant has so much as a criminal record or any affiliation with a potential terrorist organization. I think if immigration officials were here before us, particularly the Deputy Minister, he'd want to say that you're both wrong, which I think probably presents some interest to this committee of what you had to say. I think, Mr. Bissett, I'll zero in on some of your comments because I think as a committee, as parliamentarians, we really need you to uncover your suggestion, to provide further evidence to your suggestion that there really is basically no screening that occurs to the thousands and thousands of would-be landed immigrants to applicants to Canada. Could you elaborate on what evidence you have for that particular suggestion?
Well, we have the evidence of the Deputy Director of CSIS, Mr. Hooper, who gave evidence before another parliamentary committee that 1 in 10 applicants in Pakistan get security screened. And that was 2 or 3 years ago when even the volume of immigrants coming to Canada was not nearly as large. So very few are being screened for security. On top of that is the problem I mentioned that in many countries it's somewhat meaningless because, and I know cases myself, I did a full investigation of a Chinese triad member who from Macau was running all the rackets in Macau. He ended up in Vancouver. Investigation revealed, of course, he had a completely clean criminal certificate from the Macau Chief of Police. Obviously, he bought it. And bribery and corruption in many countries are endemic, and you can get any kind of a document you want. We used to take ministers of immigration into the marketplace in Islamabad or Delhi and ask him what university he would like to have a graduating certificate from. Harvard, Columbia, Oxford, and for a few rupees you got an authentic copy of a degree from Cambridge that only a professional would know the difference. So, I mean, I think even more important than the security screening is the fact that at one time experienced visa officers working in Islamabad or working in Dhaka interviewed the immigrants and their wives, and through a series of questions and counseling could tell very quickly whether the person was someone who could come to Canada and live comfortably here according to our kind of basic principles and traditions and values. And they had at that time, and this was controversial, and they still have it, I think, in the Act somewhere, but it's not being used, the discretion to maybe turn people down or to accept people who didn't meet the point system. They used their good judgment about whether these individuals coming to Canada would be able to quickly establish themselves, get a job, be on their own within a year without government help, and do well. And the immigrants prior to 1990 did well. We didn't have to spend millions and millions of dollars on their integration or their settlement. They came here and got settled themselves. And we never had problems with integration as such. The immigrants that have been coming since then, because there's so many of them, they're not being interviewed, they're not being counseled, they don't know about Canadian values or principles or our traditions of free speech, gender equality. None of that, none of those principles are taught to them or counseled. They don't get it. They used to get it personally, and they used to get it in group counseling sessions.
Thank you, Mr. Bissett. Mr. Chong, welcome to the committee. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Bissett, I've got some questions for you to continue on with Mr. Burns' line of questioning. You stated that at one point experienced visa officers screened applicants who were applying for entry to Canada. Were all applicants screened by visa officers at one point in our country's immigration policy?
No, not. Some of the family migrants, like parents, grandparents, children, were not necessarily seen. In some cases, yes, but in most cases, it was the principal applicant, the independent immigrant, that was interviewed. Yes.
Is it safe to say that at one point in our country's immigration policy during our past, the primary applicant, all primary applicants were interviewed by a visa officer?
Yes.
And when was that policy ended?
Well, it started, I think, probably in the early 90s, when the volume of immigrants started to increase to 250,000 a year, and the visa officers abroad simply couldn't see everybody. So they had to just do it by paper. Yeah.
You referenced testimony given by the Deputy Director of CSIS, Hooper, who had said that out of Pakistan, only 1 in 10 applicants are being screened for security purposes. Do you know what the current levels of interviews are being done for primary applicants today, setting aside the security screen, but the interviews by visa officers at our consulates and embassies?
Percentage, but visa officers that I know and talk to on a daily basis tell me very, very few are interviewed.
I presume it would be more than 1 in 10.
I can't answer that.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
You know, one of the concerns you raised in your opening remarks was the issue of security, which is what this study is all about. And you stated that your view is that one of the most important tools we could use to ensure our security is to conduct more human intelligence. In other words, more interviews on part of our public service of people who wish to come to Canada. And that at one point prior to the 1990s, we did that for primary applicants. So the question is, in your view, what is the, if we're going to address the concerns that you raised, and we're going to do that by conducting a greater number of, if not all, interviews of applicants to Canada, it seems to me there's two ways to go about doing this. One is to increase the resources of Citizenship and Immigration Canada in order to handle the record volumes of people that are arriving on our shores, or alternatively to reduce to adjust the levels of immigration and foreign workers in order to ensure that the department has the sufficient resources to do those in-person interviews, or a combination of both. So just want to get your views on what you think is practical, and what would be the right approach, what you would recommend to the government.
Well, I agree with there's two ways of doing it, essentially, and maybe a third, and that is one that's being proposed now, I think, by the government, that is to let Canadian employers do a lot of the selection. If they went abroad, I was the officer in charge in London in the 70s, and many Canadian companies would come to England to recruit, particularly machine tradespeople, tool makers and machinists, lathe operators, and they would interview them and recruit them and promise them a job. And we would give them a very cursory interview to make sure that they were not, didn't have a criminal record. And if we were concerned, although we weren't really concerned much about it in England, security, we would have referred them for security. But other than that, we processed them quite quickly and got them here quickly, because they had already been recruited by Westinghouse or Massey Harris or a firm. And the government, I think, is thinking of perhaps doing that in future. That's another method of doing it. So my own view is we're taking too many people into Canada. I mean, I'm on the record of saying that. Why are we one of the few industrial countries in the world with 36 million population that has to rely on foreign labor to fill our jobs? That's inexcusable in a modern country. So yes, I would cut back on the numbers and get the quality.
I have another last question for you, and that is that over the last several decades, the federal government has devolved significant responsibility for immigration to provincial governments. I mean, this started with the accord between Canada and Quebec that was revised a number of times, but it's also now spread to other provinces. And so, one of the things that I hear from people is that there is a concern that there are now, dozens and dozens of different ways to get into Canada through federal or provincial programs, often with very different rules and very different processes in place. Is it a concern to you at all that this myriad of ways to enter Canada is creating a system so complex that it is making it more difficult for us to address the security side of immigration?
Well, absolutely. I entirely agree. I mean, if you look at the 2010 annual figures, 17% of the 280,000 immigrants that came in were selected under the federal government's point system. That's 48,000 some immigrants out of 283 were selected because they met the points. The rest were families accompanying the principal applicants. They were relatives sponsored by other relatives in Canada. They were almost 13,000 caregivers, would you believe it, who came in, and 30-some or more thousand from the provinces.
Thank you.
Those again, are not, they don't require to meet any kind of selection criteria. The province chooses them. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Davies.
Mr. Bissett, I was quite stunned by your testimony. If I wrote it down as literally as I could, that none of the temporary foreign workers go through security or health checks.
Some do health. I said criminal. Criminal and security.
Okay, and of course, under this government that the use of temporary foreign workers has, I think it's a fair comment, to say, exploded. We issued 185,000 visas or reissuance of visas to temporary foreign workers last year alone. It's been estimated that there's approximately 500,000 temporary foreign workers present in the country, and you're telling us, your testimony, sir, is that none of them have gone through criminal checks, and yet this government has let them into our country?
As far as I know, they don't have any criminal checks or security checks.
Okay,
they do, if they're working in health-related occupations, they do have to have a health test.
Okay, now you were kind enough to say that you were old enough to be blunt, and I'm young enough to be impertinent. So I'm going to put a couple of tough questions to you, if I may. You just to probe some of these. You referred to the fact that there were mosques in this country, and implied quite strongly that there are mosques that are preaching unacceptable messages. What can you tell us who those mosques are, sir?
No, I can't tell you, but I get this from Muslim friends of mine who are in a position to know. I could name them, and I'm quite sure they could tell you the name of the mosque and be willing to. Salim Mansour, who's a professor at Western University, is one who is...
second hand about that? I just want to know if you have direct knowledge.
Yeah.
Second, you said that there were some 40,000 Iranians who have entered our country from 2000 to 2009. Are you aware of any cases of Iranian terrorists in this country?
Only one that I can think of who was eventually actually removed. I forget his name. He was an Iranian, or alleged to be an Iranian agent, and was ordered deported. That's the only one I can recall.
Now, in terms of numbers, it's always an open battle, I think, in Parliament about the numbers of people we let in. You've made an inference that we're letting in far more people today than we were in the past. Now, I've done research, and as a percentage of population, from 1860 to 2009, we let in 0.97% of our population. From 1900 to 1949, we let in 1.34% as a percentage of population. From 1900 to 2009, a little over 1%. The current rate today is 0.7%. So as a percentage of population, we're actually low by historical standards. Now, the only possible explanation, if your testimony is accurate, is that we had far more people checking 20 and 40 and 60 years ago than we do today. Is that the case?
No, that's not the case, but the numbers were lower all through the 70s and 80s. I think in the, the largest number that came to Canada were, I think, in 1913. We had 400 and some thousand people come here.
Checking all those?
We weren't checking them at
no.
all. We were sending them out to the prairies.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Some of those were my grandparents. So, if I might just turn to Mr. Brower. Thank you. Mr. Brower, I just want to give my remaining time to you. You've been listening to testimony. What other points do you think we should know that you feel are important?
Thank you very much. The one point that I did want to follow up on a little bit has to do with, well, a couple of points. One is with respect to the screening and the comment of the CSIS officer that only 1 in 10, applications from Pakistan, get security screened. I think we need to keep in mind that visa officers do have the tools to do the screening they need to do. Every decision is made by a visa officer. If the visa officer thinks on paper there's any possibility of a security concern, they can conduct an interview, they can seek advice from Canada Border Services Agency, they can send the case on to CSIS to get advice. This is the process that I see. Of course, I deal primarily with refugees and with family members of refugees trying to come to Canada. And I can tell you that in virtually all of my cases, there have been personal interviews and issues around security have been examined pretty closely. The other point that I had hoped to make is with respect, again, to this the issue of visa officer competence. And I'd refer you to a decision of Justice Snyder in the federal court from, I think it was April of last year, in a case called Gurmatsian, and I can forward that to the committee. But Justice Snyder undertook a very careful assessment of the training and the competence of visa officers overseas. This was all with respect to one particular officer. But I think that her comments about the degree of training and oversight and support for visa officers is enlightening. And I'd like the committee to keep that in mind as they hear the comments of the immigration authorities talking about
thank you, sir.
The wonderful decisions made by visa officers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Meningakis, you have 1 minute if you're fast.
I'd be happy to pass that minute on to one of my colleague on my left. Or
as soon as the lights ring, you're finished.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I'm on Mr. Meningakis' left.
Oh, are you?
Okay. Time's a wasting. Get going, Mr. Who's going? Mr. Weston?
Fine. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Well, it seems like we almost stand at a very important moment in history. And Mr. Bissett, Mr. Brower, thank you both for speaking to us. If you had one suggestion for us as a committee to improve the security for Canadians, what would it be?
Well, I certainly disagree with Mr. Brower that Muslim immigration and my focusing on that is a human rights issue. Anybody who can read the newspapers these days or watch television knows where the terrorist acts are occurring and who's doing it. I think Europe has given us an example. If you don't deal with these issues early, you've got a very serious problem on your hands. And I think we should make sure, I wouldn't go so far as Raha Razil, a very prominent Muslim woman in Canada, author and writer and commentator, who has advocated that we have a moratorium on Muslim immigration until we can get more clear an idea of who's coming.
Thank you.
And so I would say that's the most important thing.
I'm sorry to both of you. We have to go. The bells are ringing. They're silent bells, but they are ringing. And we have to all go and vote. So you're both very qualified witnesses, and we appreciate, on behalf of the committee, I thank you, Mr. Brower and Mr. Bissett, for making the contribution to the committee. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.
Thanks.